Hey guys, Whitney Sparks here with Dwell With Me Ministries. I hope I'm coming through okay, and I'm sorry if you can hear my dog in the background. If you've listened to me before, then you've probably met Tex a time or two. If you're joining me live, feel free to just say hello in the chat or just kind of let me know that you're here and that you are with us. If you, I also put in the chat that we are joining live or starting in Exodus chapter 1. So hopefully I'll have some people on. I was going to try to share my slides with you all, but of course, a lot of these platforms, it takes a little more money than what I'm sometimes willing to pay to get all of this on there. So again, if you're joining me live, feel free to say hello in the chat. Feel free to participate along with me. And then you can also join me. You can see this Bible study live at whitneysparks.org/Bible study. So feel free to join me there and kind of click along the slides as I'm going through these verses. So Exodus 1:1 says, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man in his household came with Jacob. There was Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." So I've just done the study with my ladies in Sunday school. That's Exodus 1:1-7. And I also taught this to our kiddos at church as well. But let me kind of point out a few things. First of all, when you don't know names in the Bible, there's no judgment here. Nobody's judging that. Feel free to just pronounce it the best you can, but I would rather you really look up the history of that name. Really identify, do you know that person? Have you heard those names before? Does that sound familiar? Use your index in the back of your Bible and go hunt those names down. Or sometimes I just Google to kind of see what these names would have meant. So feel free to, again, if you know those names or they sound familiar, like Reuben or Simeon, Levi, Judah. If you've read the book of Genesis, and those should sound very familiar, those are Jacob's children and also the 12 tribes of Israel. So again, when you're reading through names in the Bible, don't let that discourage you. And don't be like me. I used to just read those really fast just to bypass them and get through it as quickly as I could. But that doesn't serve any purpose. So reading those names of the Bible can really be helpful and help you to kind of understand the lineage and kind of the understanding of where these families are headed next. So there's a lot happening in Exodus 1:1-7. If you're joining me live, feel free to say something in the chat, or if you have questions, just let me know. 1-7 tells us that here, this generation has died off. So all of Joseph's brothers, if you've read the book of Genesis from 37 to the end, man, great stories. The book of Joseph is just awesome. We just talked about that one in Sunday school. So as you're reading through the book of Exodus, those people have now died off. We learned that Jacob was gone at the end of Genesis, the father, all the sons have died off. So these are now their offspring. These are the children's children, or maybe great-grandchildren of Jacob. So several generations kind of down the line. What's interesting is if you read the book of Genesis, then you know that God commanded Joseph. He lived in the palace there in Egypt, but he also brought all of his family to Goshen, to that region called Goshen. So here they are, still in that same spot, that same plot of land. And God is doing something that he always is good about doing, multiplying and helping them grow. They're being fruitful and they're growing, they're multiplying, according to verse 6 and 7. So again, when you kind of hear those phrases or hear different terms in the Old Testament, I know sometimes it can be difficult to read, but don't let that discourage you. Make sure that you find those points and mark that down. There's going to be many times that God says that the children of Israel grew and they multiplied, and that can only happen by the grace of God, as we're about to find out with the rest of the story. So I'm now in Exodus 1. I'll read about 8-11 or so. Let me stop somewhere in there. Again, if you're just joining me live, you can find my slides. I couldn't share those today, but whitneysparks.org /Bible studies. Feel free to join me on there, and my slides are posted for Exodus chapter 1. So now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel, they are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with vigor. You know, I was a school teacher for 20 years. And of course, we talked about things like slavery, even in school. And I always reminded my kids that happened way before even the 60s and that era. Slavery has gone on since Bible times, since the book of Exodus. And that's exactly what we are experiencing here. Is God telling us or sharing with us that Joseph's people, these Israelites, are now going to be in bondage. Someone just said that. Thanks so much for joining in. Yeah, Babylonian captivity, Assyrian captivity. Here we go. Here's kind of the start of it. I've been reading a lot about Babylonian captivity in the book of Jeremiah. Thanks for chiming in. But here's kind of the official start of all of this feeling of bondage. Is their homeland, is where they've grown up. And here they are in Egypt. And let me say something, though. If you've read the book of Genesis, this is not the same Pharaoh. We notice that in verse 8, there's a new king over Egypt. Sometimes Pharaoh is called Pharaoh, and sometimes he's called a new king. So that's kind of another misstep. We need to be careful when reading, especially the Old Testament. You can't just say, oh, that's the Pharaoh, and it's kind of a one-size-fits-all. That's the Pharaoh for Joseph's time. There could have even been another one between Genesis and Exodus, but this is another Pharaoh that has now entered the scene. And what do we know about this Pharaoh? He didn't know Joseph. He didn't know Jacob. He didn't know these 12 tribes of Israel. And if you remember in the book of Genesis, at the very end, Pharaoh helped Joseph to get there. And he really listened to Joseph. He trusted him. And he allowed for his family to come stay in this region called Goshen, which is located inside of Egypt. But this Pharaoh, totally different king, a whole different mindset than what we saw with the Pharaoh back in the book of Genesis. So here they are. He's a little worried, a little concerned. I think we see this even with leaders in power. Sometimes they have faced a lot of fear. We were talking about this when I talked with the teenagers, that a lot of leaders have a lot of mental health issues. Let's just put it bluntly and say that they deal with a lot of mental anxiety and distress. And a lot of that is fearing. They're fearful of the people that may revolt. They're fearful of being killed or something happening to them in that realm of leadership. And this Pharaoh is no different. He says in Exodus 1:9, look, the people of the children of Israel, they're more and they're mightier. They're growing. They're getting to be a bigger camp inside of this land of Goshen. So here he has an idea, here's how the plot kind of thickens. If you like a good soap opera, Exodus 1, and really those first several verses are a good way to have that, get that soap opera feel. So here he says, let us deal shrewdly with them in the event that they will continue multiplying. So he's nervous and he doesn't want war to break out. So in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and they fight against us. So I just mentioned those leaders get a little bit nervous. They get a little bit antsy whenever they're afraid of people revolting or someone hurting them, or like someone has said here, a different dynasty, and killing off really their initial land. So we forget about this a lot of times, that land is huge, and there's even still fights and still battles today in the Middle East, and a lot of that revolves around land. And I'll kind of bring this up a little bit later, but when you hear the words, the Abrahamic covenant or the Abraham Accords, Abram Accords, that is all based in the Old Testament. So that's how we know the Bible is true. That's how I know that it's real, because even things that are being mentioned today are still part of God's word. This is where it all started. And it started with that land. So you have to think about these people, how they came into, the Israelites came into this land of Goshen, onto their homeland. So I think they're feeling a little bit of, not really jealousy, but maybe just contention that, well, these are strangers on a foreign land. And this is where my family had land. And this is where I've always grown up. So he has a plan to set these taskmasters over the Israelites, and they're going to build these cities, Pithom and Ramesses. It's interesting to me. I was just telling one of our ladies that I wonder, maybe somebody in the chat will know, or maybe you can Google this while I'm talking, but I wonder if the Israelites would have been one of the ones to build the Great Pyramids. I don't know. I don't know how long those have been around, but I wonder if any of those cities or any of these things that they would have been built in Exodus 1 are still around today. But there was a problem in verse 12. As we know, God is a God that is powerful, and we think that things are impossible, but God is a God that makes all things possible. In Exodus 1:12, it says, the more that they were afflicted, the more that they were abused, the more that they were enslaved, God kept multiplying and growing his people. Isn't that just like God? It doesn't matter what's going on around me, that God can still see something so great, and he can still provide for me, and he can still grow me and multiply my spiritual walk, even when we feel defeated and we don't even know how to get out of this trial, or we're walking through the fire. And I love that about God. I love that. The next part says they were in dread of the children of Israel. So we learned already. So the Egyptians made them serve with rigor, building this mortar and brick, as we spoke about as well. So let's read Exodus 1:15 through 18. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name was Shiphrah, and the other name was Puah. Did I say those names correctly? I have no idea. I mentioned that earlier. When you're reading the Old Testament, don't get caught up in trying to say the names correctly. I want you to focus more on identifying what the names mean, or if you have heard of those names before. So here he is. The Pharaoh was speaking to these Hebrew midwives, and he says in verse 16, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing? And why have you saved the male children alive? So here again, we see Pharaoh kind of conjuring up a plan. He's nervous. He's kind of sweating bullets, and he's trying to figure out, okay, this group in the land of Goshen, they're growing, they're multiplying, they're getting bigger, and I don't want their boys to grow up to become men. Why? I asked my ladies that on Sunday, why would he instruct the Hebrew midwives to take out the male children, but not the females, not the daughters? Well, as you know, probably, especially in this time, they would have been, the men would have joined in war. And the Pharaoh mentioned that earlier. He didn't want these boys, these babies, turning into boys, grown up into men, to join an army and then fight against the Egyptians. That was his biggest fear. So he had this plan that he was going to tell the Hebrew midwives, who probably, I don't know the lifestyle of a midwife, but I would assume these ladies had a relationship, right, with the women who were pregnant. So I would assume that they knew these ladies. They knew if they were having a boy or if they were having a girl. And they probably walked with them during these 9 months and kind of gave them like prenatal care, just kind of at least checked in on them. So I'm going to assume that they have a really solid relationship with these women. I don't think they're meeting them for the first time on these birth stools, unless there's really just that many that are popping out one after the other. So maybe that is the case. Some of you may know better if you know the lifestyle of a midwife. I've never used a midwife, so I'm not sure of that process, but I would just think that according to Exodus 1, that they had a close relationship and close ties with these ladies. So Pharaoh's plan to destroy these children is whenever they see the mom giving birth to this child on the birth stool, that the midwife is to kill the baby right then and not let that child survive. So here's going to be my soapbox for today. If you've ever had someone tell you that God believes in it's okay for us to abort children, I would encourage you to go look in Exodus chapter 1 and go look at verse 17. The midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they saved the male children alive. I just think that has no basis, no grounds with God whenever it's right here in his word. They did everything that they could to save these children. And we're going to see they put their lives at stake. They should have been killed for what they're going to say. And yet they defended those innocent children, those innocent babies who can't speak for themselves. They can't fight for themselves. They're just a child. And here they are standing in the gap for those babies. So I encourage our teenagers, if someone ever comes to you and says, I think I'm pregnant, didn't know I was pregnant, I'm going to abort this child, my boyfriend doesn't want it, that's not the answer. Adoption is the answer. Give that baby to someone who's never been blessed to have a child of her own. So I encourage you to think about that. If you're a young person joining me live, feel free to use that context in Exodus 1, verse 17. That is not okay in the book of God. It is not okay in his handbook to take out these children and to hurt them in any way. We see that with Jesus, how much he loved the little children. Even when his disciples said he's too busy and he's too tired for the kids to go away, Jesus said to let them come to me. In verse 18, he calls the midwives. There's the Pharaoh, and he says, why have you done this thing? Why did you save the male children whenever I'm telling you specifically that you're to be disposing of them, to be getting rid of them? I love verse 19, Exodus 1:19, if you're joining me live. The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives are able to come to them. So one of my ladies said, oh, they lied. And I said, think about what was at stake before they uttered those words to the king of the land. First of all, not only are their lives at stake, could they have been punished severely for what they did or didn't do in the eyes of the Pharaoh, but he could have also sought out, and we're going to see this, he's not going to let it go. He could have also sought out those children and done great harm to them as well. So yes, they did tell a little white lie. I know with God that sin is sin and lies are lies, and there's not a little white lie. But we're going to see that God blessed them even in this moment. I'm at the very end of Exodus 1:20 through 22. Therefore, God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied, and they grew very mighty. So it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them. Let me talk about that word fear just for a moment. A lot of times when we think the fear of God, we think afraid. And I will say, I brought this up to my ladies one time, even with my dad. I'm 45. I think my dad is 73. But even with my dad, there comes a lot of respect there. Yes, sir. No, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. I don't think he's going to bend me over his knee and give me a spanking of any kind. But I do know that I am very reverential to my dad. He deserves that respect because he is a great man. He is a great man of God. And it's the same here. These midwives feared God. They're not afraid of God. What they are is being reverential to God. We've lost a lot of that in our society, unfortunately. So if you're joining me live and that you struggle with that, I just ask you to pray and that you seek God through that time of showing others respect. So this is what that looks like, that I acknowledge God and I respect him in that way. So not only did he keep them alive, he could have killed these midwives according to verse 1 and then 19. verse 117. But instead, he not only kept them alive, but he also blessed their households, and he gave them children of their own. But the plot thickens. Of course, it's not going to end there with a perfect ending. Exodus 1:22 says, so Pharaoh told all of his people, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. And guess who's going to enter the scene in Exodus chapter 2? A great man named Moses. I can't wait to share that part with you. You can find all of these on my blog, whitneysparks.org/Bible-studies. Feel free to check those out. Also, I've got several books on my YouTube channel. This one's really popular right now. Dwell with Me. I've got it in several formats. You can find it on audio. You can find it on Kindle. You can find it on paperback as well. That is one of my 4 books that I've written. And it comes in Spanish. So feel free to check this one out as well. If you're wanting to grow in your spiritual walk with Christ, if you're wanting to know more about Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and then how to use those fruits, if you are already a child of the King, feel free to check out those 2 books as well. Also, I've got another ebook on my blog, whitneysparks.org/books for free. 41 ways, 41 practical steps to growing in your spiritual walk with Christ. So make sure and check out those resources. Everything right now on my blog is for free. Eventually, some of those things may be locked up and there may be a price for it, but all of that is free. So hope you can join me live. I'll try this again another day. We'll just kind of play it by ear. I hope that you all have a wonderful and blessed day. And thanks so much for tuning in today. Have a great day.